My wedding dress was still hanging on the door when I understood that no one was coming to explain anything. Not my mother. Not my mother-in-law. Not the bishop's wife who had squeezed my hands at the reception and said, "You're going to be so happy, Hannah." The house was empty. The dishes were done. The candle on the nightstand was burning low, and I was 20 years old, sitting on the edge of a bed in a room that was now mine, in a life that was now mine, and I knew absolutely nothing about what the next hour required of me. Nothing that was true, anyway. I had been given fragments. Whispers, the particular non-language of women who know something they have been forbidden to say plainly. Be a good wife, submit with a willing heart, it will become natural. Natural. I sat on that edge and I thought, natural to whom? Under what conditions? Starting from where? No one had answered those questions. No one had been asked to. I was raised Old Order Amish in Tuscarawas County, Ohio. I married at 20. I left the community at 28. I share what I lived through because the gap between what Amish brides are told and what they encounter is not accidental, it is maintained deliberately, and it costs women things they spend years trying to name. This video is about that gap. About the specific things that are never said, and about what it means to learn them the hard way, alone in the dark, with no language and no one to call. Subscribe if you're new, stay for all of it. This is the conversation I needed someone to have with me when I was 20 years old and the candle was burning low. The first thing no one told me was that I was allowed to feel something. Not perform something, not absorb something. Feel it. Fear. Confusion. Discomfort. The particular vertigo of a body being asked to do something it has no framework for. These were not mentioned, not as possibilities. Not as things a bride might experience and bring to someone who could help. The emotional reality of a wedding night was not a subject. A bride's feelings were not a subject. The entire interior experience of a young woman crossing that threshold was treated, by every person responsible for preparing her, as either irrelevant or already handled by the covenant. The covenant had answered everything. A good wife trusted the covenant. What I felt that night was real. It was mine. It was asking to be acknowledged by someone. There was no one there to acknowledge it. I learned to put it away. Quietly, efficiently. The way I had been trained to put away anything that did not serve the functioning of the household. The putting away took about 3 years to complete. The finding it again took much longer. The second thing no one told me was that my body would speak. Not metaphorically. Physically, pain is information. Discomfort is information. The way a body tenses, withdraws, signals distress. These are communications from a self that knows something the mind has been trained to override. I had been trained to override. From childhood I had learned that the body's signals, particularly anything related to physical intimacy, to discomfort, to the desire for distance, were less important than the role's requirements. That a good wife managed her body's responses and presented the correct exterior regardless of the interior. So when my body spoke on my wedding night, I did not listen. I overrode. I overrode for weeks, for months. I overrode until overriding felt like the only mode available to me, and I had almost entirely lost the ability to hear what my body was saying underneath the management. A therapist told me, years later, that the body keeps a record. She said, "Everything you overrode is still there, Hannah. It did not disappear, it waited." She was right. I spent 2 years in therapy retrieving what I had spent 8 years burying. The third thing no one told me was that my husband did not know either. This one took me the longest to understand, and understanding it changed the shape of everything. I had assumed the way I think most young brides in our community assumed, that the silence around the wedding night was a female silence. That men were told things in their own separate education. That the information existed somewhere and had simply not been given to me. It had not been given to him either. Samuel was 24 when we married. He had been raised inside the same silence I had, with the addition of entitlement. He had been taught that a husband's authority over the marriage bed was God-given and non-negotiable. He had not been taught what to do with a wife who was frightened. He had not been taught to ask. He had not been taught that asking was his responsibility. He arrived at our wedding night with authority and no knowledge. I arrived with compliance and no knowledge. 2 people with no knowledge and an enormous power imbalance in a room with the door closed, with the theology of covenant as the only framework either of us had. That is not a foundation for intimacy. That is a design for harm, not because either person intended harm, but because the conditions made harm almost inevitable. The fourth thing no one told me was that there would be no morning after conversation. In the world I had glimpsed through fragments and whispers before my wedding, I had hoped that whatever happened in the night would be followed by some kind of acknowledgement. Some checking in. Some moment where two people who had just experienced something significant together looked at each other and said, "How are you?" Samuel got up before dawn. He dressed in the dark, the way he always would. He went to the barn. I lay there and I listened to the barn door close, and I understood that what had happened in the night was done. Filed part of the marriage now, unremarkable to be repeated and never discussed. Not because Samuel was cold, because neither of us had been given a language for the conversation that should have followed. Because in the community we came from, what happened between a husband and wife was not processed through conversation. It was processed through silence, through prayer, through the performance of ordinary life the next morning. I made breakfast. I put on the face. I told myself this was what marriage was. For 3 years I told myself that. With impressive consistency, what the community offered brides in place of preparation was this: prayer, the example of older women who had survived their own wedding nights and every night after without speaking of it, the theological framework of submission, which converted every difficulty into a spiritual opportunity, a chance to grow in faith, in patience, in the particular virtue of endurance. And the communal fiction that Amish marriages were wholesome and simple and free from the complications of the English world, that the purity of Amish courtship produced a purity of Amish marriage that needed no discussion because it was already correct, that fiction was maintained by the silence of every woman who had learned not to speak. Each woman's silence taught the next woman that silence was the correct response, and so the fiction reproduced itself, generation after generation, carried not in documents or doctrine but in the things that were not said at kitchen tables across 300 years of Amish marriage. There was a woman I will call Agnes. Agnes was 74. She had been married 56 years. She was the oldest woman in our district, and she was treated with the particular deference afforded to women who have outlasted everything the community required of them. She came to my house 6 weeks after my wedding. She did not bring food. She did not bring advice about the household or the marriage or the correct way to manage Samuel's preferences. She sat across from me and she looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Nobody told you anything, did they?" It was not a question. I looked at her. I did not know what to say. She said, "They didn't tell me either. I have been married 56 years and nobody told me, and I did not tell my daughter, and she did not tell hers." We kept passing the silence down like it was something precious. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "It is not precious, Hannah. It is a debt. We owe you what we were never given." She looked at her hands. She said, "I am too old and too deep in this community to pay that debt fully. But I can tell you this much. What you felt on your wedding night was real. It was yours. It was allowed." She left 20 minutes later. I sat in the chair she had vacated and I cried for the first time since my wedding day. Not from grief, from the particular relief of being told that something real had happened to me. I described my wedding night to my therapist 8 years after it happened. I described the 4 things no one told me. The feelings I was never given permission to have. The body I had been taught to override. The husband who had authority without knowledge. The silence that swallowed the morning. My therapist said, "What you're describing is a person who was sent into a significant physical and emotional experience with no preparation, no language, no support structure, and no legitimate channel through which her experience could be acknowledged or addressed afterward." She said, "The harm is not always in what happens. Sometimes the harm is in what is withheld, the preparation that was never given. The words that were never handed over, the morning conversation that never came." She said, "Agnes was right, it is a debt, and you have been paying it alone since you were 20 years old." I thought about Agnes, about a woman of 74 who had seen enough to know the debt and was honest enough to name it and trapped enough inside the community to do very little else. About what it costs to know something that clearly for that long without being able to change it. The women who did not tell me were not my enemies. My mother gave me silence because silence was what she had been given. My mother-in-law said it would become natural because that was what she had told herself for 40 years and eventually it had become true enough to say. The bishop's wife squeezed my hands and said I would be so happy because she genuinely hoped I would be. Because the alternative, that the system she had given her life to produced young women sitting alone on the edges of beds with no language and no one coming, was not something she had the framework to hold. They were all inside the fiction. They had all been formed by it early enough that the fiction and the truth were indistinguishable from the inside. The system produced the silence. The silence produced more women who could only pass the silence down. A debt paid in the same currency that created it. What breaks that chain is not anger at the women who carried it. It is naming what the chain is made of. That is what I'm doing here. This is an Amish story. But the 4 things I described, the unfelt feelings, The overridden body, the partner with authority and no knowledge, the silence that swallowed the morning, these did not stay inside Amish walls. If you entered a significant intimate experience without preparation, without language, without anyone checking whether you were all right afterward, then you know something of this. If you were taught that your body's signals were less important than the role's requirements, if you learned to override so thoroughly that you lost access to what you actually felt, if the morning came and went and no one asked, I see you. You were not too sensitive, you were not weak, you were sent somewhere significant with nothing in your hands. What you felt was real, it was yours, it was allowed. Agnes told me that. I'm telling you, Agnes, you were 74 years old and you had been married 56 years and you walked into my house 6 weeks after my wedding and you said the truest thing anyone had said to me in my entire life. It is a debt, we owe you what we were never given. You could not pay it fully. You told me so, but you showed up and you named it and you told me that what I felt was real and allowed. That was not nothing. Inside a system that had spent 20 years telling me my interior experience was secondary, that was enormous. I have been trying to pay that debt forward ever since. This channel is how I do it. Nobody told me before my wedding night, so I'm telling you now. Your feelings on that night were real, they were yours. They were allowed. Your body's signals were information, not inconvenience, not failure. Information. You deserved a partner who had been taught to ask as much as to expect. You deserved a morning after conversation. You deserved someone sitting across from you saying, nobody told you anything, did they? And then saying, what you felt was real. Consider this that conversation. It is not too late for it to matter. If one of the 4 things I described today was something no one told you either, leave a comment. Just a number. 1 through 4. You do not have to say more than that. If you need more than a number, if you're inside something right now, there are resources in the description. They are for anyone who needs them. Subscribe. The next video is about what happens inside an Amish marriage when a wife gets pregnant for the first time. What is expected of her body, what the church says her husband is still owed, and what an older woman told me in a garden that I will never forget. That story is coming. I will see you there.